Good morning and welcome to ASL's HR in 10.
At 10.
I'm Jason Perry,
And I'm Kimberly Bradshaw.
and on a Thursday morning, just because we're bored otherwise, we get together on YouTube live to talk about what's going on in the wonderful world of HR and employment law. So I'm kind of thinking we ought to be talking about some of the changes in sick absence rates this week, Kimberly.
Yes, I mean, there was an article, wasn't there, in the week saying that we're at the highest levels of sickness absence in over a decade.
Yes, I'd kind of be interested, and I did have a look at the news on this. I'd kind of be interested to see what long-term trends are and whether or not there are, at times of crisis, shall we say, these go higher. Because, I mean, there's some obvious things, isn't there? There's right now still a lot of COVID about. I've seen more COVID in the past couple of weeks than probably in the past 18 months.
Yes, and also, the cost of living crisis and
Indeed.
mental health stress and all those
We
kinds
have
of
all these things kind of blending together to
yeah.
make times rather tough for people. And I mean, the worry people have perhaps causes them to take more time off when they're feeling under pressure. There were some interesting comments in here, and I think a couple of the ones that were picked up and quoted in the article I read were teachers, all anonymous, of course, but were teachers and talking about the sheer amount of pressure they now find themselves under. And I guess within the teaching profession, we've got a whole range of difficulty there, even before you bring in, let's say, the concrete buildings problem, or the recent stresses we've had with attendance, the recent stresses we've had with exams in the past couple of years, and how those are dealt with. So I can kind of see why it's quite tough for them.
Yes, and some of them were talking about toxic working environments, and I'm sure that with all the government regulations that they have to follow and the curriculum and all the extra work they have to do to over and above the teaching of the children, I can imagine it would be very
Yeah.
stressful.
Bolt on top of that a war in Ukraine, a cost of living crisis, and kind of this. Be interesting to see where certainly the education sector is, but broadly the working from home issue. I wonder what working from home is doing to sick absence rates.
Yes, that's interesting. I had a case recently where somebody wanted to work from home when she wasn't well enough to drive to work, and which obviously was more a sickness absence issue rather than a flexible working request. And it's like, well, if you're not well enough to drive, and she described the symptoms, and it's like, well, if you've got those symptoms, you're not well enough to work either, because being on a computer exacerbated her symptoms.
Yes.
So I think, do people either want to work from home because they don't feel like going in, or do they want to, if this is not a normal part of their behaviour, if they're working from home, do they sort of poddle on regardless, and are just not as effective?
Yeah, I actually think there's a good argument for when people, let's say, are not 100%. And I say this as, a senior person, we rarely stop. And it kind of doesn't matter how unwell we get. There are things that still need to be done. So I can say, for example, even when I had COVID, whenever that was, 18 months or so ago, there were times when I was still at my desk working because the work I do had to be done. So I think there is an argument that people can work from home and can do things. I guess it depends whether you as an employer expect the same level of output, or whether or not, oh dear, we're going into employee engagement here, aren't we? Whether or not you have the employees' well-being at heart, and you're sympathetic to their position and support them, perhaps in working in a not necessarily part-time, but part output capacity. I wonder God, that's an interesting one to talk about, isn't it?
That is, and that would be really interesting. I mean, you and I have talked a lot about
Mm,
sort of output rather than other measures of
mm.
performance. And to be honest, a lot of small businesses, I don't think, are able to gear up to that. But the article also got me thinking about how many companies are actually dealing with their sickness absence,
Mm.
because I've had quite a few cases that I've been working on recently, where it's gone on for ages and people have had a massive amount of time off.
Before
And
the company intervenes. Yeah.
exactly. And before they come to me and say, oh, this person's done this, and
Mm.
you go and have a look, and one of the measures we use obviously is the Bradford factor scores. um, I had one recently where the Bradford factor score was 32,000 and something,
Mm.
and the majority of employees are under five.
Yes.
It's very,
The
very.
the other really interesting one, and most of us who've, let's say, been around a little in HR know this as a unwritten point there. Public sector sick absence rates are around double private sector sick absence rates. And I guess there's some fairly big questions around why. Now, there is an obvious one here, which is larger organisations tend to have higher sickness rates, in part because they're just more generous with their sick pay. So, dare I say, it's easier to take sick days when
Yeah,
you're a civil servant or you work for, a huge corporation that's going to pay you.
yeah.
Whereas if you work for a small company, you immediately know that your fellow workers are going to be under pressure and you know that your pay packet might be a little lower.
Exactly.
Does that incentivize or motivate people to try to do things when maybe it's questionable?
Yes, I think you're right. I mean, it's easier if you know that you're still going to get paid. It's much easier not to go to work than if you
Mm.
think, well, I'm going to be on statutory sick pay. And I know civil service, I don't know what their terms are at the moment, but a few years back, they had the most phenomenal occupational sick pay. And
Six
it's like,
months full pay, I think, is quite normal.
well, when I knew about it, it was over a year.
Yeah, 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 wouldn't
And
surprise me.
And it's like, well, goodness me.
Do
No
you
wonder
know?
your sickness absence is high.
Yes. I always find this interesting how we try and get together and cram a lot of interesting content into 10 minutes. But, just over halfway through and talking about the public sector, I'm kind of thinking maybe we should move on nicely and talk briefly about Cambridgeshire Council. I think it's South Cambridgeshire
Oh, and
Council,
their
isn't it?
4-day week trial, yes.
Indeed. It's not that many weeks ago you and I were talking about a government minister intervening and ordering South Cambridge Council to abandon their 4-day week trial.
Yeah.
Seems they haven't.
Well, I can quite understand that. Why would they? They agreed to a set term, which I think finishes in March, and they need evidence to
Well,
support
I
whether it's
have to
been
say, I'm
or not.
absolutely delighted that they've ignored the commands from the minister.
Too.
I, I think it's a great thing. There's some interesting data that seems to be coming out of it, and it's nice to see a public sector trial as well as just what goes on in the private sector. We've talked about Atom Bank before, which I think has shown some phenomenal success. But
They've
you
led
could,
the way on the 4-day week.
yes, but you could argue that's an exciting, vibrant, growing financial services company. But you take local government and you start to see that, for example, they have filled, I think it was something like 9 out of 23 difficult to fill roles since they've moved to a 4-day week. Um, but the other thing, and obviously I run an employment agency, I have a declared interest here. So on a personal level, I might find this slightly alarming. As a taxpayer, I'm absolutely delighted to see that South Cambridgeshire Council think they are saving £500,000 in agency fees by moving to a 4-day week. So the
Exactly, which could go to policing or, bin collections. It could cover a huge remit of
Yeah,
things.
I mean, if that's a genuine saving, the arguments from central government that they shouldn't trial this when taxpayers' money should be looked after, um, it looks like they may be really on the ball with what to do with taxpayers' money here.
Exactly. I mean, I think it's phenomenal. And when you think about it, quite a lot of the local government type roles are public facing, and usually public facing where the public have issues that need dealing with, which can be very stressful. And you're going to be far more refreshed and motivated if you're only doing it for 4 days rather than 5.
Indeed.
So it's a big one for employee engagement as well.
Yes. Yeah.
What I want to know at the end of the trial is, were customer complaints up?
Yeah.
Issues were there with bin collections, or whatever, to see what they were able to come up with.
It's going to be a really interesting one to watch, and probably the big one for me in all of this, as we look at the 4-day week, is are we managing to improve that terrible UK productivity problem that we seem to have? But as much as I'd love to talk about that, guess what?
We're out of time.
We are. HR in 10 is HR in 11 today. Kimberly, as ever, it's been lovely. Thanks so much for your time. And we will be back same time next week.